I had a much easier topic originally, and then she said, why don't you speak about the future of South Africa and Europe? And okay, so what I've done, because obviously I don't have solutions, nobody has solutions. I've put together facts and a few statistics, and I will take you through them, and then I make some to me compelling deductions, but we can then discuss them, I think. Right, this one, there we are. I'm starting with the challenges in Europe, and I'm going to do it in English, but you can follow the German if you prefer. The German recession is quite severe, and we have a GDP decline of -5% for 2024, and we have a 4.4% decline in exports. And this is relevant. Why? Because Germany is actually the fourth largest economy in the world, just after Japan. 6% unemployment, 35% of German companies with negative business expectations, and 40%, up from 38% last autumn, consider their financial situation problematic. That is quite tough. Foreign direct investment, FDI flows to the EU in 2023 were 25% below 2022, and FDI outflows from the EU more than doubled in 2023, driven by a dramatic increase of foreign direct investment into the USA, now the world leading recipient of FDI. In 2023, non-OECD G20 countries, that includes South Africa, saw a decrease in FDI inflows of 53% compared with 2022. Energy costs in Europe increased since 2000 by 400%, from 0.08 to 0.43 euro per kilowatt hour, and that translates into a 1 trillion euro loss, according to Bloomberg. The likely defeat of the EU's Ukraine policy will result in a wasted 325 billion euro investment loss. That's a figure compiled by a very respected Weltwirtschaftsinstitute in Kiel. The banking risks are enormous if some $300 billion Russian sovereign deposits should be confiscated. There is an impaired access to global markets due to sanctions and OECD transaction rules. Those in business here know how difficult it has become to fulfill all the KYC, due diligence, and good governance requirements. Deindustrialization is a reality in Germany. Overregulation, high environmental and labor costs. In Germany, 30% higher than in the USA, or 80% higher than in Croatia. It unfortunately carries on. Economically unsustainable population decline with a EU-wide fertility rate of 1.46. For a stable population, we require a fertility rate of 2.1 per woman. Some clever politicians thought they could make up for it through migration. Migration now approaches 20% of national populations in the main EU countries, and that, surprise, surprise, gives casting votes in elections and enormous influence in politics to Islamist pressure groups. And the result, inevitably, is right-wing and populist political activism, which in the last year has gained over 10% in support in recent elections, and it pushes, in some countries, the right-wing parties over the 30% threshold, according to a recent survey in February. Now, let's look at South Africa's misery in contrast. We have an astounding first statistic. The GDP per capita in year fell 25% from $8,000 in 2010 to a current $5,970 or $6,000 per capita in year. Meaning in this relatively short 14 years, South Africans became 25% poorer. That has not happened anywhere else. The debt to GDP ratio at the same time rose from just over 20% to nearly 80% currently. So a substantial part of the drop in GDP was made up with borrowing money. The IMF puts South Africa's growth forecast at 0.9%, and that stands against a growth ratio of 3.4 to 5% in Africa. February 2024, South African statisticians figured a fall of the manufacturing sector contribution to the GDP from 23.1% in 1993 to 13.2% in 2021. At approximately 50%, because we have 24 million out of a total population of 62 million, depending on social welfare disbursements. South Africa has fallen to the 83rd position out of 180 countries on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Formerly world-leading infrastructure, electricity, rail, road transport, port, and all South African enterprises, and 194 out of 257 municipalities are insolvent. Our import and export administration, as well as the immigration laws, are antiquated and ineffective. We have a backlog of about 100,000 residence permit applications. By registered deaths from unnatural causes, there's a statistic. When you die either of natural causes or of unnatural causes. By the registered death of unnatural causes, South Africa has a record homicide rate of 41.9 per 100,000. It was higher. In 1995, it was 61.1%. But the global average is 6.1. We have a road traffic death rate, which is another sad world record. 110 out of 100,000 against the global average of 17.4. And then, astonishingly, we have double the world's suicide rate. 24.4, globally 10.4. And to top it all, former Finance Minister Manuel, now chairman of Old Mutual, he announced last week that the capital flight from South Africa is, by him, put at 1 trillion rand, which is equivalent to $50 billion. It won't surprise that the perceptions of South Africa in the EU are overcast, are overshadowed. I'll give you some examples. Georg Jacke, head of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Johannesburg, wrote 3 months ago in January that the stagnation of South Africa is reflected in the failure to rebuild the historic parliament building in Cape Town that was destroyed by arson already 2 years ago. Claudia Bröll for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and we all know that is the leading German newspaper, daily newspaper, wrote a month earlier that the Madiba mythos has faded and no longer inspires South Africans. The equally very influential Tagesspiegel announced in April 2023, schwerste Krise seit Ende der Apartheid, most severe crisis since the end of apartheid, and found that South Africans are enraged against their political elites. Auch Chancen für österreichische Firmen. South Africa drowns in problems, but that gives opportunities to Austrian companies. So let's look at these opportunities. And I'm going to try and list the risks for South Africa according to a very recent November 2023 KPMG Africa survey, which was basically done for the German Federation of Chambers of Commerce. And the risks that they identify is that there will, or maybe, but probably will be a decline in foreign direct investment and a reduction in bilateral aid because of the recession in Europe. That a growing EU market protectionism will result in constraints for South African export. Let us just think of the citrus scandal, where somebody invented a completely harmless and non-transmittable tiny fungus on the skin of citrus and made a crazy regulation that citrus from South Africa must be kept for a month at minus degree freezing temperature, destroying the citrus. So that's it. That's the end of our export of citrus to Europe. Fortunately, Russia and China are importing the same citrus. Another risk is the increasing climate change conditionalities for EU trade and investment. Increasingly, large corporates from the EU have to impose on business in South Africa their climate change targets. There's a further general risk of capital devaluation, high inflation, and an antiquated forex regime of controlling the movement of foreign currency. We have a lack of ICSID protection. That's the International Center for Investment Arbitrations from the World Bank. And South Africa is one of the few countries in Africa that is refusing to join that convention. And we also have a lack of bilateral protection for investments because all the investment protection agreements with the European countries and the main trading partners of South Africa have been cancelled. We have an absence of a proper export processing zone framework, EPZs. Instead, we have the IDZ regime as we know it in Kucha, and it is dysfunctional. And then, of course, German companies that were surveyed indicate corruption, crime, the energy crisis, and maladministration, bad administration performance as the main investment deterrents. The survey, we can go through it quickly, summarizes some interesting results. There's a global increase of foreign direct investment into Africa, and it's substantial. You can see it here in the graph from $153 billion in 2000, 20 years later in 2022, it is 1,063 billion. The foreign direct investment in Africa by investor countries is interesting. The UK and France are leading. The red line is Germany. It is basically stagnating. There isn't much of an increase. The green line is America, the USA. China is the blue line, the light blue line. Sorry, that's the one that is climbing rapidly, and France is the dark blue line. 59% of German business consider Africa expansion. They have that in their business plans. And they say, the dark blue, 20%, they say, we will consider Africa as a place for diversification of our investments for the first time. And the purple line is the big bulk. We are going to expand our business activities in Africa. 71% of German companies view Africa as a positive investment destination. 51% of German businesses are satisfied with their business in Africa. It is half.